I might have gone a little overboard with this set, particularly for just one dungeon room, but I think it turned out pretty well. So. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Garmin. This, of course, is the Storycraft Society, and we have taken a little break on the channel here from Wave Echo Cave, but it is time that we jumped back into it, and I'm really excited about that for a bunch of reasons. There are 4 videos already on the channel of this series, so if you want to check those out, I will link all those in the description below. But today we're working on Room 9, which is known as the Great Cavern now, but a long time ago this was the banquet room, meeting area, and mead hall for the miners who once inhabited Wave Echo Cave. So with that said, nothing else to say, let's jump into it. So I started this project the same way that I start a lot of my projects. I just pulled out my 2-inch thick XPS insulation foam and I started to trace out the general shapes. Now, the important thing to remember here is, like I always say, approximations will do. They do not have to be perfect, so do not waste a whole bunch of time trying to plot out the exact perfect size for all of these cavern rooms. If they're a little bit off, or there isn't a bubble where there should be a bubble or something like that, it's really not that big of a deal. But once I got those traced, I cut them out, and then once I cut them out, then it was time to move on to my 1-inch thick XPS. Now the 1-inch thick is what would end up making my base. I wanted it to be a little thicker because I want it to be a set piece that stood up a little bit off of the table, and also it'll make it really easy to drop these upper pieces on and trace them out to get the whole shape of the room. So there are 2 areas on my base that I need to be concerned about. There's one that I'm going to be cutting on the line that I traced, and then there's going to be another area where I'm going to be cutting a little bit wider than the line that I traced. So I'm going to mark those areas that I need to cut on the line with a Sharpie, and I'm going to mark the areas that I'm going to cut a little wider with just a pen so that it's a little bit of a different line. It's important to leave the extra areas on the outside of where the ledge pieces will be, because eventually I'm going to be using plaster to make those look a little bit more slopey and natural, like cavern walls. Now, once that was all cut out and I had those plotted out correctly, then it was time for me to move on to shaping my cavern walls. I did this by making an angled cut around the top of my ledges. To knock down the sharp, unnatural looking edges on these pieces, I then took them outside and was really aggressive with a nail file. And it's actually a good thing, because all of those extra notches and tears that you have in your XPS foam is going to make your edges look a lot more unplanned, unintentional, and therefore will look more natural. Now, to texture all of these XPS pieces, I'm going to be using a tinfoil ball just like I do all the other times. Everything gets it. That makes it very simple, and it will get everything looking nice and textured. I actually have a special tinfoil roll, tinfoil tube. I actually don't know what to call this, but I have a long, thin piece of tinfoil that I ball up. You can just take and fold it and then just roll it until it makes a long, thin piece of tinfoil. And then that's what I use to texture into my tight areas that I can't get to with a regular tinfoil ball. Now, the very last thing that I did in this stage is I made the pillar that goes up on the western ledge. And actually, I just made it the exact same way that I made the ledges, just on a smaller scale. Same thing. Cut it out, cut the angle at the top, tinfoil ball and nail file over the whole thing to eventually end up with my little pillar here. All right, so now it was time to glue all these pieces together. And I found that on big areas like this, hot glue is actually a little bit of a challenge because it dries so quickly. If you end up using the hot temperature setting, if you have a multi-temperature glue gun, it will end up melting your foam before you get it in place. And if you use the low temperature setting, which is made for foam, it ends up being dry by the time you go to put the pieces on. So I really prefer to use Eileen's tacky glue in this application, although any white glue would do. So what I did was I put it all over the bottom, I smeared it all over, placed the pieces on, making sure to leave those edges around the outside, and then I took Dungeons & Dragons books and stacked them up on top to weigh them down and make sure that the pieces stay glued in the right place. Nice, good bond, all that stuff. And while that was drying, I moved on to my rock molds. So I'm going to be doing rock molds on all of the interfaces of the room, because that's where all the minis are going to be and that's where all the exciting stuff is going to happen. So I pulled out my Woodland Scenics rock molds and my plaster. I'm going to be using Hydrocal lightweight plaster for this. And then I began mixing it up and pouring my plaster into my rock molds. Now I did this the exact same way that I did in my Epic Hill video, so if you want to see a more in-depth tutorial, you can go back and check that video out. I linked it in the description below. But in the middle of pouring the plaster, there was a complication, so Take it away, Pass Garmin.
Isn't this how it always goes? I was right in the middle of a pour and I ran out of plaster. So I have to go off to the store to buy more, but I hate to tell you, but y'all have to come with me. So let's go. Also, Connor's going along. Right, babe? Right?
All right, I'll be right back. Be good. Hey Charlie, how are you? Good. Boom. Right in the middle of a pour.
We ran out.
Isn't that how it always goes?
It's always the way it is. It's always the way it is. 1483.
Yes, sir.
Look at all this. So sick. Let's get back to work. So here are these two blocks that I cut out to be the basis for the stairs. Now what my plan is to run two pieces of foam core on either side like this. I'll make like a brick texture in here so that what will be revealed as the stairs come down is more of this brick. But my plan is to just take a pencil and sketch out some like rough stairs. And then from there, just kind of go with what the knife cuts give me. We'll see. All right, let's jump into it. So I started by sketching out a rough idea for the layout of the stairs. Then once I had something that I was happy with, I took out my Alpha knife and began to carefully start to cut them away. Now the good news about this is that there is no need to be clean with these cuts. You want to be careful with the knife, but there's no need to be clean because old rough hewn stairs do not need to be perfect. In fact, they will look worse the more perfect you make them in this particular setting. And then I textured them up with both my tin foil and my nail file to get it just right. So real quick, I wanted to touch on why I textured the stairs the way that I did. So I took a nail file and I went over the treads of the steps, but it's really important to remember that this is the part of the step that's going to wear away. It's not going to necessarily be these outside corners. So in a dungeon or this ancient forgotten dwarven ruin, you have to remember that this is the part of the stairs that are going to wear away. Another good thing about weathering these old steps is that when you use your nail file, you don't have to be super careful. So when you get these rips like this, it actually just adds to the character of the stairs. And I guess the final thing that I'll say about these is that I always tend to think that they look worse than they are when they're just foam. As soon as I get the Mod Podge on them, and particularly when you get paint on them, they'll end up looking awesome. So the next thing that I have to do is pull out my foam core and start making the walls. Once that's done, I'll show you what the whole thing looks like together. So I just finished up doing the walls for my little staircases. And one little trick tip that I'd like to give for when I'm doing old stone compared to new stone is that when I'm doing new stone, I like to use an X-Acto knife and score all the edges and then run through them with a pencil. That gives a lot of really nice, clean definition. With these, I actually like to just use a crappy pen. And I go real slow over it one time to draw out the actual brick texture, but then I'll go over it a bunch of times with the pen and it kind of rips and tears at the foam. I don't know if we'll be able to see this or not, but it like rips and tears at the foam and gives this really cool aged stone look. So anyway, let's get these glued in and then move on to the next. So I did all of my stair work while my plaster rocks were drying, and the good news for me is by the time that I finished the stairs up, so were my rocks. So I broke them all out of the molds and then proceeded to glue them all into place. So to start the plaster work, I took all of my rocks and started to assemble them into the places that they go. Now the important thing here is it's just like putting together a puzzle, but it's a puzzle that was not intended to go together, I guess, so you're trying to make it work instead of it just naturally fitting together. But I actually really enjoy this part. If you want to see a more in-depth tutorial about this, this is going to be my second mention of the Hill video. Please check that out. I linked it in the description below. This is mention number 2. But when that was finished, I had to move on to the daunting but actually simple process of using the plaster to blend everything all together. I mixed up a plaster paste and then used my finger to just scoop it and push it down into the crevices. This is actually a pretty simple way to do it. You just have to be patient and move your way slowly around and try to smooth everything out. Look for any place where there is an unnatural looking crack and you can just easily blend it all together with the plaster. And I know I'm a broken record, this is number 3, but if you want to see a more in-depth version of this, please check out the Hill video. Seriously, go watch the Hill video because it will help with all of this plaster work for sure. Just a quick little update. I actually just finished doing all of the plaster blending into my rocks. And I'll tell you, every single time I go to get into this project, well, this particular part of the project, I always think that it's gonna take me a super long time. But with setup, actually doing the job and cleanup over this entire piece, it only took me an hour and a half. Honestly, it's one of those things for me that I think once you get in the rhythm of doing it, it just goes faster than you think it will. Now, of course, if it's your first time doing it or you're a real perfectionist with it, it'll take you longer. But when I'm just like slapping stuff on and moving along quick, yeah, start to finish, hour and a half for that stage, that's awesome. So now I'm gonna let this all dry and then we'll move on. With the plaster finally dry, it was time for me to put my ground texture over the whole thing, which is just gonna be a layer of Eileen's tacky glue and sand. It's the easiest way I found to get a really good looking ground texture, and it finishes pretty hard, so at least for me it seems very durable. But that still leaves one issue to be solved, and that's the gaps in the stairs. If I were to use plaster to do this, it would get all over the walls and actually ruin a lot of the texture there, which I didn't want. So the way that I decided to do this, actually I thought was pretty simple and very effective, was I took and just let the sand from the ground covering fall down into the cracks. Then I pulled out my isopropyl alcohol and watered down PVA glue. I got an eyedropper and I went drop, drop, drop with the isopropyl alcohol. The key here is to not put too much, because if you put too much, all the glue will run straight through the sand and out onto the bottom. So you just want to just barely get the sand wet with the isopropyl and then take and do the exact same thing, drop, drop, drop with the watered down PVA glue. And that will basically make all that sand in those gaps absolutely rock solid. It's like little pieces of cement down in there. It's great. So this worked out super, super well. But then I let my sand dry and I tapped off all of the excess, and it was time to put Blackmagic Craft base coat over the whole thing. Now, Blackmagic Craft base coat, as most of you know, is a 50-50 mixture of matte Mod Podge and black acrylic craft paint. And what that really does in this example is it locks all of the sand in a way that the glue on the bottom is holding it down, and then the matte Mod Podge really seems to seal it from the top. Something that on a project like this, I absolutely couldn't do without. But you'll notice that I left all of the white plaster rocks with no Mod Podge on it. That's important because that's going to come into how we paint those later. Also, this is really important. I consider this a public service announcement. If you are putting Blackmagic Craft on your piece and you do not have appropriate dance music on in the background and then do this, your Mod Podge will not go on as strong. I mean, that's absolutely 100% not true. I just wanted to give a shout out to the awesome music that I really enjoyed listening to while I was doing this Blackmagic Craft base coating, and it was Coffee's Tiny Desk. And if you're a fan of reggae music or just good music in general, you should definitely check that out. I linked it in the description below. So once my Blackmagic Craft base coat dried, I moved on to painting the rocks. It's really important that you don't put the Blackmagic Craft base coat on the rocks because that would seal them and stop this next painting process from working, and I find it is absolutely 100%, no question, the best way that I know of to paint plaster rocks and make them look really realistic. So I got this from Luke over at Luke's APS, as well as Neil from Real Terrain Hobbies. It's called the leopard spotting technique. And both of those guys do this, and they made it look easy, and I realized how easy it was. If you want a more in-depth look at this, you will actually have to check out the second video in the Hills series. I will link that in the description below. Don't get mad at me. See, it's a totally separate video. It's not that one. Again, this is the second one. The overview on how to do this is basically start by dropping everything. I mean, I couldn't hold on to a single thing when I started to do this. It was miserable. I dropped a paintbrush. I dropped my water bottle lid. I dropped a bottle of paint. Ugh. Back to leopard spotting. Take 3 colors, sometimes more vibrant is better, but I try to stick to a little bit more vibrant but earthy, if that makes any sense. And then you want to water them way, way down. You want to get them to the point that it is almost a wash, and then you're just going to splash them all over your rocks, making sure that some of the white is still showing. Then take a black wash and go over the whole thing. That kind of neutralizes the brightness of the colors and brings them all down to a more consistent look. And then the last thing that you're going to do is dry brush over all of the rocks with a medium gray, and then dry brush down over the top with a light gray. That gives you all of your definition on the little sharp edges that make them look so interesting. The rest of the way that I painted is all just the standard way that I paint. So on the blocks, on the stairs, and on the outside walls, I did my 3 grays. So that's a dark gray, a medium gray, and a light gray. And then over all of the ground texture, I did 3 browns in the same way: dark brown, medium brown, light brown. But that's it. That wraps this whole setup, and I am so pleased with how this thing turned out. I definitely went more overboard than I normally would. For one dungeon room with one encounter in it that isn't a boss fight, this is probably more work than I would normally put into it, but it is really, really cool, and hopefully I'll get multiple uses out of it. Obviously, the way that you dress the setup will certainly change how the whole thing looks as well. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, definitely leave me a like down below. In the comments, let me know what you think. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. That goes a long way to helping a small YouTube channel out, as well as the best way possible that you can help the channel, which is to share this video with a friend that you think would enjoy it. But with that said, that's all I have for this week. So until next week, I'll be seeing you.